all about Abingdon and why, of all places in the world, this car that you and I love so much was built there. I'm sure you all know that MG was founded on a wing and a prayer, effectively by Cecil Kimber, and it was made in all sorts of little places, garages, workshops, corners of other factories, for the first several years of its existence. And it wasn't until 1929 that it got what you and I would call a permanent home at a factory just south of Oxford. I came past it this morning on the way up here, about 7 miles south of Oxford in Abingdon. It was a factory that had been making leather goods during the First World War. It was empty at the time, and let me get it right, Lord Nuffield took over most of that factory and decided to have MGs made there. For the next 50 years or thereabouts, that was where MGs took shape. And I use the phrase took shape carefully because I'm not quite sure whether it's clear even to everyone here that very little of an MG, very little of a T-Series for sure, was made at Abingdon. Abingdon was very much an assembly factory, not a manufacturing factory. In other words, the chassis came from the pressings for the chassis came from somewhere else. The body shell came from somewhere else. The engine came from somewhere else. Abingdon was very much an assembly factory and not a manufacturing plant. The capital investment in the place was small, and I think I can tell you, in truth, although I never met the man, that Lord Nuffield was never really very interested in MG. It was his, he owned the company, he indulged Cecil Kimber to make it work, but he was never very interested in MG. He was certainly never very interested in sports cars. And just as long as the factory sort of paid its way, and somewhere in here you'll find one particular page which tells you year-on-year figures for profits and losses, just as long as things got by, he would indulge Cecil Kimber in the models that he wanted to produce and also in the motor racing that meant so much to him, to Cecil Kimber that is. Lord Nuffield was, therefore, the typical absentee boss. He very, very rarely went to Abingdon, he very rarely got involved in MGs at all, and I think we could almost call it the Kimber Car Company. And I'm surprised that Alistair Naylor didn't take up that name to put the badge up his car in the 1950s, 60s. It was very much the Kimber Car Company because Lord Nuffield was the absentee boss. Cecil Kimber you know about. He's a man who's still, how can we put it, he's still lionised by most of you people. Without him, for sure, there wouldn't have been an MG company in the 20s and 30s. There would, of course, have been a T-Series, and we'll come along to that in just a minute, but there certainly wouldn't have been a thriving MG company up to and including the 30s without Cecil Kimber. He looked upon MGs as his personal empire. He looked upon them as the car that he had invented, which he had. He looked upon MG as the cars for which he personally developed the marketing image. And so he loved it so much that he clashed with corporate management on many occasions. Without Kimber, there wouldn't have been a midget. Without Kimber, there wouldn't have been the whole line of overhead camshaft cars, the magnets, the Magners, the midgets, all that sort of thing. And it is fair to say that it was his idea, and although he wasn't an engineer, he was a stylist, by the way, although he was not an engineer, he knew what he wanted. Fine, that worked quite well. As you would find by looking at the financial page in there, there were times when MG teetered on bankruptcy, there were times when they sold far fewer cars than he hoped. And even Lord Nuffield, who, as I say, didn't really care too much about MG. Lord Nuffield was so rich it didn't matter. It's rather like you and I owning a rowing boat and leaving it on the beach most of the time. Possibly he didn't really care, it didn't matter very much to him. Lord Nuffield just let it go, and eventually there were times when it could have gone rogue. Then, In the mid-1930s, and it's one of the most boring times I've ever spent, I've read a lot about this, Lord Nuffield got involved in a running battle with the Inland Revenue regarding profits and all sorts of things, all because he was a stubborn old so-and-so who had not organised the finances of the Morris Company and his other companies sufficiently well. If I can therefore make it clear, in 1935, and this is when the T-series story starts, Lord Nuffield owned the Morris Company personally, no shareholders. He owned Wolseley, ditto. He owned MG, ditto. He owned also the body makers that used to be called Hollick and Pratt and so on. He owned several businesses separately. None of them were protected by limited status, none of them were collected together. It was getting out of hand. And in the 30s, in the mid-30s, he finally saw sense and brought into his company a man from one of the offshoots of his empire called Leonard Lord. Now, some of us respected Leonard Lord, like me. I never worked for him. If I had, I probably wouldn't have respected him. But, well, I got a note here that said, Leonard Lord, the axeman cometh, because he was known as a man who was very ruthless. He had started his working life as a production engineer. He worked for many years at a company in Coventry called Hotchkiss, who made engines, and they became Morris Engines. He then went to Wolseley and turned Wolseley into a profitable business. Lord Nuffield brought him into Cowley, sat him down and said, I think we should rationalise my businesses. This meant, if you like, doing the big amalgamation, the big takeover altogether. So Leonard's job was A, to modernise the companies, and B, to put them all together. The modernisation of Morris Motors is known about. It defies belief, does it not? In 1935, when Leonard was at his height in this business, the Morris production line still involved pushing cars from station to station, in the way that they always were at MG, by the way. So Morris Motors were making 100,000 cars a year, and every one of those was pushed along assembly lines. There were no moving assembly lines or anything like it. But Leonard sorted that one out. But what he also did was to say to himself, and also say to Lord Lennon, who also said to Lord Nuffield when he would listen, or when he was there, because Lord Nuffield was often away on extended overseas trips. He said, we need to do what General Motors have done in the States. We need to start using fewer engines, fewer different types of engines. We need to use fewer different suppliers here, that, the other. And therefore, also, so he said, we have to get rid of everything MG has done before. We have to get rid of the engines, which were Wolseley engines. We have to get rid of all the little details like that, and we have to get rid of the separate little cottage industry atmosphere at Abingdon. We have to get rid of the engineers at Abingdon. Sacrilege, you might say. Absolute and utter sacrilege. But nevertheless, Leonard made one of his whirlwind visits to Abingdon. According to the notes I've seen, his first visit to Abingdon was made without notice. He just turned up at the front gate. Terrifying, I can tell you. Brian Rainbow and I both worked in companies where if that happened, we know we'd have committed suicide on the spot. Leonard took one look round and decided he didn't like any of Abingdon, and he said, right, the first thing we're going to do is stop motor racing. Bang, finish, no more motor racing at all. We're going to stop building record cars, we're going to stop doing the new models that were being worked on, which were advanced new models. These were cars like the R-Type Racer, with road cars to follow, that had things like independent suspension, different chassis frames, quite advanced styling, and almost by definition, they were going to be more expensive. A stroke, the landlord said, no, get rid of those. He said to Kimber, as of, this was say Thursday, as of Monday, he said, the MG company management will be relocated at Cowley. Now that's about 8 miles away. And dear Jack Daniels, who I'm sure you all knew, Jack is no longer with us of course, dear Jack Daniels once said, and he was one of the senior chassis designers at MG even then, He said quite suddenly, at a weekend's notice, we had to move to Cowley. Not only did we have to move to Cowley, but we had to move to Cowley having abandoned everything that MG was famous for at Abingdon, and we had to start again at Cowley. Now this is where the T-Series story really starts, because the two engineers that mattered, one was Hubert Charles, H.M. Charles, who was the chief engineer. Second was Jack Daniels, that worked for him. They moved into scruffy offices in Cowley, one or two helpers, and they didn't really know what they had to do, but they were rapidly told by the chief engineer that the whole, what became the Nuffield organisation, this was a man called Robert Boyle, who quite soon afterwards quarrelled with Len Lord, but then most people did, and he went off to Rover. But they were told, Charles and Daniels were told, start designing a new sports car, and by the way, it has to have no relation whatsoever to the PA and PB and the magnets that were made, are still being made at Abingdon. It must have a modified version of Morris or Wolseley engines. It must have a modified version of Morris or Wolseley gearboxes. And by the way, it must look almost exactly like the PA/PB. The miracle is that this brief was enough for these people to take a deep breath and look around and decide what they can do. Oh, by the way, they said, Robert Boyle and Len Lord above him said, and I want that car ready within a year. Think about it, within a year. These days, it takes up to 4 years to build a motor car from scratch. They wanted the TA, as it became known. They wanted the T-Series within a year. Jack Daniels, of course, who became Ali Pisagonis' right-hand man for many years, and he was a really remarkable design engineer, a man who always had pencils going out of his fingers, and he was never happy when he was drawing things. He had been at Abingdon as a young designer, even at the end of the 20s. He once told me when I went to interview him in retirement in Christchurch, near Bournemouth, that he had started life sure he was going to be a farmer, and one way or another became an engineer. He had been designing chassis frames for MG since about 1929-30. He was much involved in the midget and so on and so on. Much of the R-Type chassis was down to Jack as well. He said, as far as innovation was concerned on the T-Series, they didn't have a choice. They were told, this is the car we want. Then Lord said, I want a car with a wheelbase of, I think it was 7 feet 10. If I'm wrong, please don't correct me, because I do forget these things. He said, we want a wheelbase of 7 feet 10. We want this. We want a modified Wolseley or Morris engine, and so on. And they started work in July 1935. The first car, and there were probably only 2 prototypes, the first cars were running in early 1936, as you know very well. The TA was announced in the middle of 1936, only 11 months down the road. Now, the miracle is that, and I say this honestly, not because I don't want to be lynched by any of you people, the miracle is that the TA was a good car. It could have been awful. I mean, given this time schedule, given the sort of restrictions that these designers had, it could have been awful. And yet, they had enough nous, they had enough experience, they knew what, incidentally, there was this undercover liaison with Timber that never went away. They would go and see him every weekend and talk about it. They did a remarkable job of producing a motor car, which, and I'm sure all you people would agree, the TA was a better car in all respects than the PA and PB. And it was better in all respects, mainly connected with the fact that the engine was more reliable, and there was just a little bit more space, and it was just a little bit more civilized. Dear Wilson McComb, who was a senior historian who I admire greatly, no longer with us, I'm afraid, dear Wilson McComb once said that he had long talks with people like Cecil Kimber and Seska Cousins and the others, and they all said the same thing. The TA was a much better car than the P-Series, even though it didn't have the specialised engine. even though it wasn't designed at Abingdon. So the miracle is that the TA really was as good as it turned out to be. Now, these days, if one set out to build a new car, like the MGF of 1995, we know that took about 4 years to work up from a clay model to a wide wheel to what's the competition, to all that sort of thing. It took 4 years. With the TA, the most important thing, first of all, was to sit down and say, what are we trying to achieve, and what's the competition? Well, they knew what they were trying to achieve, which was to improve on the PA and PB, but the competition was very thin in those days. The only real car that mattered in competition to the TA was the Singer 9, or the Singer, whatever you like to call it, sports car, Singer 9 Le Mans of the period. Because it wasn't until after the TA came along that the Morgan was introduced as well. So it wasn't a big marketplace. And by the way, the important thing is to make it clear that in those days, MG did not have a big, thriving export market at all. So almost every car that they built was being sold in this country. And it's still a surprise to a lot of people to realise how few T-Series cars were built before the war. And again, I have not got the exact figures here, which proves I haven't spent all week reading this up again. I think the figure is something just over 3,000 TAs, am I right?
2002.
How many?
3,002.
Not about guests, about 3,000. Thank you for that. And TVs, of course, was in the low hundreds. So almost all those cars were sold in this country. The balance would go to what I, in my dotage, call the empire countries. The few would be going to Australia, the few would be going to Canada, and so on and so on. But there was no big export market, which explains why the car was made totally in right-hand drive, and totally, if you like, therefore, was what you or your ancestors like to think was a typical British sports car. It also explains why the car took shape the way it did. A, because the landlord wanted it that way, and B, because people like Charles and people like Kimberley wanted it to be like this. They wanted a car still, because it was cheap and cheerful to build, they wanted a car with leaf spring suspension. They couldn't be bothered with independent suspension. Okay, the Germans and the Italians had had it for years, but the British didn't need it, old chap. So we will keep beam axles front and rear. They certainly, because of the numbers, 3,000 in 3 years, we said, because of the numbers involved, they couldn't afford to go in for heavy tooling costs on bodies. And at this point, I therefore have to make it very clear again to you people that the bodies could not possibly have been made at Abingdon, because Abingdon did not make bodies at all. They were made not far from here, in Coventry, at a company which had by then become known as Morris Bodies. To my joy, when I first came to work in Coventry in the 1950s, the late 1950s, yeah, I really am that old. When I came to work in Coventry in the late 50s, Morris Bodies was still there, still known as Morris Bodies. And it was tucked into a corner of a trading estate, in fact, behind the Armstrong Siddeley factories, very close to the railway line. And this was the factory which had been known as Hollick and Pratt, the factory that had originally started making bodies for Morris, and they'd been taken over by Lord Nuffield, whatever his name was at the time. They were specialists in making bodies from wooden skeletons with steel panels, and I believe it's still quite true that the TA and the TB and the TC that followed, I believe they took shape in the same way in Coventry at Morris Bodies as earlier MGs had done. In other words, there was some sort of rudimentary jigging to make sure that all the body shells, the wooden body skeletons were the right shape. And then the panels, some of which were flat panels, but some of which were very mildly shaped, they were quite literally nailed to the wooden skeleton. I'm sure there are people there who've lost fingernails and things trying to get the panels off. There's smiles all over the place, so you know about nailed panels and things like it. That happened by tradition at Morris Bodies, and it carried on like that, by the way, until the 1950s for sure, because as we know, those of us who followed the industry ever since, Morris Bodies also made TVs, they also made TFs, they also made Morris Minor 1000 traveller bodies, they also made bodywork for the Riley M series, the bigger Riley M series. All of them with wooden skeletons and with steel panels, or light alloy panels here and there, nailed to it. Fair to say, I think, that those were built down to a price, very much built down to a price, because Landlord, for all his faults, was a ruthless cost cutter. He was absolutely ruthless in wanting to get the best out of his designs. He wanted to get profit into the company, because frankly, also Landlord was on a contract which gave him a share of profits. He was no fool. He got a share out of increasing profits. Not as much as he wanted, because that's the reason he walked out, but we'll come to that in a little while. The engine, I'm not sure whether the TA owners here will like to be reminded of this, but the engine of the TA came about by what I call Hobson's choice. Hubert Charles and Jack Daniels wanted a bit more horsepower than the PV. They were looking for about 50 horsepower and got it. They also needed a small capacity engine. They needed a physically small engine if they could. In the end, the only engine that made any sense, that wasn't the overhead valve correction, that wasn't the overhead camshaft engine, which was being phased out of Wolseley anyway, the only overhead valve engine that could be found had recently been announced and fitted to various Morris motor cars. Now, that engine has got a considerable historic influence, because way back when Landlord was a young man and when Hotchkiss was still Hotchkiss before it became Morris Engines, the 1920s Bullnose Morrises used a side valve engine built at Hotchkiss, and that engine had something that people like me understand. It had a trademark stroke figure of 102 millimeters. 102 millimeters. Everything that came out of Morris engines in the 20s, in the 4 and 6 cylinder side valve range, had a 102 millimeter stroke. The bore depended on how much tax was going to be paid in each particular model. There was no overhead valve version of that engine for at least 15 years. So that engine had been made and improved, and then it wasn't until about 1934 that even an overhead valve version of that engine existed. Suddenly it was there, suddenly it was quite suitable, and suddenly that was the engine that, by Hobson's choice, became the engine in the TA. Now, I remember driving T-Series MGs in the 50s when they were getting old and I was trying to get old, and they weren't the most high revving and they weren't the most smoothest engines around, but that's what there was. So the only question really that I needed to answer then in my head was, why Morris Bodies? Well, that was traditional. We must not forget that the Nuffield organisation, which is what it became, when Morris and MG and Wolseley all get together, it became the Nuffield organisation. Their near neighbours at Cowley, which just happens to be a factory where modern minis are now made, their near neighbours at Cowley was a company called Press Steel. Now, Lord Nuffield used to have a shareholding of Press Steel, but he'd sold out of that a few years earlier. Press Steel was the rising independent body maker, and they wanted the business. They really, really, really wanted the business. The problem was, and the figure of 3002, thank you for that, sir, 3002 tells its own story. 1,000 bodies a year made no sense to a company like Press Steel, who were used to pressing panels and welding them together. They wanted to make 1,000 a week if they could, not 1,000 a year. So that explains why they didn't even get the chance of making the bodies. So there we have the TA. It came along in 1936. Those of you who are lucky enough to read the magazines of the period, and I'm lucky enough to have a huge library with all the magazines there, it is amazing to see how the technical writers of the period all kowtow to landlord or kowtow to Lord Nuffield, saying, what a wonderful idea, isn't it a lovely simple car? In other words, they were really crawling on their knees to say it was a good car, which it was. But the point I'm making is that they were willing to go along with the theory that everything Cecil Kimber had done before the T-Series was a mistake. But it wasn't a mistake, because the one thing that is also to be found here in the financial page, or thereabouts, is that once the T-Series went into production, profits began to improve. This is the point at which we have to say goodbye to Landlord. Some of us would have been glad about that at the time, but Landlord, in about 1936, had a colossal row with Lord Nuffield, because although Landlord was Nuffield's managing director, he thought he was underpaid. And he had a huge row with Lord Nuffield over money, walked out, and as I think most of you know, not much more than a year later, then reappeared as works director of the Austin Company, and thereby hangs a tale, because eventually it all came together again as BMC in the 1950s. For a couple of years, the TA sold, and sold well. And this car, of course, was now the most important single car at Abingdon. We must remember that at Abingdon at the time, the last of the PBs were being built, but also there was the new 2.2 litre SA and the VA coming along. There were quite a few cars being built at Abingdon, but we're still only talking of 2,000 or 3,000 cars a year. Now let's get this down to days. That's probably 50 cars a week. That's probably 10 cars a day. It's very much cottage industry, isn't it? I think Alistair Naylor could probably have made 10 cars a day in the 50s and 60s. I mean, it really wasn't that difficult, was it? But that was the way that MG got by. There was very little MG sports car activity for those 2 years, 37 and 38, because what work there was being concentrated on these touring cars, the SA, the VA, and the WA, which came along as well. But into the equation then came a young man who most of you will know by name, and you will have forgotten that he had any influence on the T-Series at all, and called Gerald Palmer. Now, Gerald Palmer was a young man who had done great things in commercial vehicles early in his career, but he then designed a rather nice prototype, which he called the DeRoy. And one day he tried to sell the idea to the Morris, or the Nuffield organisation, who didn't want to make DeRoys in numbers, but they did like the idea of what he'd done. And apparently, almost without taking too much time to do it, the man who interviewed Gerald Palmer suddenly said, we need someone to run the MG sports car office, do you want a job? And so Gerald Palmer got the job. And in 1938 or thereabouts, he took over from where Hubert Charles had let go. Hubert Charles had gone, he'd gone off to do something else, and so Gerald Palmer arrived. But the point is, Gerald Palmer became famous after the war, of course, because he designed the Giant Javelin, he designed the chassis work on the Giant Jupiter, he did all that, and he was much involved with BMC in the early 50s. But it was before the war, but it was Palmer who ran the MG design office for 1 year only, in 38 and 39, and then of course came the war. But Gerald Palmer designed or oversaw what was going on. He did two things that are important to these cars. First of all, it was Palmer before Isigonis who designed the coil spring independent front suspension kit that eventually went on to the TDMG and the TFMG and so on and so on. But that car was originally, that suspension was originally designed by Palmer to go in a saloon car, which was going to be a Morris car, and it was going to come in 1940. And that first appeared then, as you know, I'm sure, in the Y-type saloon after the war, and then became a very important building block for most MGs. So Palmer was important there. Palmer was also important because he knew a lot about engines, and he knew that the engine that was in your TA was beginning to look very old and long in the tooth. And he was given the chance to look around and think of an alternative. And the alternative, thank goodness, was there and modern. That as a result of Len Lord's rationalisation programme, one of the big projects he'd started was a completely new small engine to be designed, again not by MG, but to be designed by Morris Engines in Coventry. And this was to go into the new Morris 10 of the 1930s, and so on and so on. Now that became the famous XP engine that you know so well. I've forgotten the acronym for the saloon cars, but it became XPAG for the T-Series and so on. That engine was designed in Coventry by Morris Engines, and it was designed to be more powerful than the old engine of the TA that was going to be dropped. It was designed to be smaller, designed to be lighter, quite a lot lighter, and it was designed to be built in huge numbers. Once again, with a very short development period in Lee. The miracle to me always is that most of the T-Series that you love so much and I love so much, none of these cars were developed over a period of years. They were developed in a period of months. In some cases, not even months. But the TV engine came along very quickly, and the TV, I think, I understand that one car was built. I think there was still an experimental department of sorts at Abingdon, which a young man called Sid Edinburgh ran, and I believe there was one car at Abingdon, a TA, into which this engine was fitted, and that became the TV. It arrived on, well, the Morris 10, yes, the Morris 10 had been announced with the basic engine already, and then suddenly this engine appeared in what had been the TA. I believe it is true to say that the TV was never officially announced in this country at all. It just happened. In other words, people found that toward the end of the 1939 buying season, they suddenly got a motor car that looked exactly like the TA and felt like the TA and sounded like the TA, but it had a different engine. Now, certainly I've read everything, hopefully, all over the place. The first reference I can find to the TV was when MG announced what cars they would have made for 1940, if it hadn't been for that German gentleman who had better ideas. So the TV was very much an anonymous motor car, which explains again how few of them were made. It was only in production from, I believe, May or thereabouts to the end of the summer of 1938-39. And it was a remarkable engine. Now, the importance of this engine is that, therefore, with apologies to the people out there who've been cooing over the TA, the XP engine, the XPAG, the XPEG, was very, very, very important to all you people, because it was then an engine that was used in the TB, the TC, the TD, the TF, and the Y series. It was a wonderfully flexible engine, and as we now know from the book that John Thornley wrote, Maintaining the Breed, we do know also just how tunable it was. It wasn't designed as a sports car engine. There was a wonderful series of articles in Autocar during the war, when Autocar was looking for stuff to write about. There was a lovely series of articles in the Autocar during the war, where the technical editor of Autocar, who rejoiced in the name of Montague Toombs, he did an interview or two with the chief designer at Morris Engines about how this engine was done. There's no question it was done purely as a built down to price, built down specifically to weight engine, which just happened to be incredibly tunable. Now, I'm sure there are people here who've done sprints and hill climbs and might even have done a bit of circuit racing in their T-Series. They will know how wonderfully solid, how wonderfully tunable that engine is. And when I tell you that it was never meant to produce 100 horsepower, or whatever it did for you guys, the miracle is that it did so. One of the interesting points of those articles in the magazine was that Toombs said to the designer, where does the design of an all-new engine start? And he said, it starts in the combustion chamber. Fascinating. This was in the days before computers. He said, you start with knowing what you want to, well, two things. He said, bore and stroke, yes, of course. In those days, we all had to worry about taxation, which was by RAC rating. But he said, apart from bore and stroke, he said, the whole design starts around the combustion chamber. And I think you would agree that that's one of the joys of the XP engine, that it is an engine which will have a good cylinder head, very tunable. You start with that, and he said the joy of moving to a new bore and stroke was that the new engine had a much shorter stroke than the T8. It was a 90mm stroke instead of 102, which meant that that 12mm, which he says is about that much, he said if you take that much off the cylinder block, and for all sorts of reasons, he said we were suddenly saving something like 50 pounds weight in the engine. And that's wonderful because weight equals money and weight equals size. So it was a wonderful engine to do. It was done for the Morris 10 touring car, saloon car. It was not done for the T series, and yet it turned out to be exactly the engine that you people wanted and enjoyed for the next 30 or 40 years. So now we come to the war. Now let me just very quickly go forward to 1939-40. Cecil Kimber was running MG, he was general manager, he was the director on the Nuffield board. The vice chairman underneath Lord Nuffield was a gentleman called Miles Thomas, who became Sir Miles Thomas. And it was those two who clashed in 1941 when Miles Thomas, who wanted his own way and got his own way, he became chairman of the BOAC after all, sometime later. He decided that he wanted to run Nuffield properly. He found that Kimber was getting his own wartime contracts for MG, which he, Miles Thomas, didn't approve of. Argument, big row, Kimber out the door. We know that. It was unfair. It is believed to have been unfair because MG, without Kimber, suffered for years before dear John Thornley took over really as the man who really reinvented the company. But Miles Thomas, therefore, was the man who, if you like, turned MG's wartime activities into purely rebuilding tanks and things like that. All the tooling and everything for the TV went into store. Apparently it went into store in a building in Abingdon and somehow survived the bombing. Or at least the TV series bit survived the bombing. And now we come to the post-war bit, which is what happened in 1945. Well, I think MG was one of the few companies in the motor industry, as far as I know, who hadn't been cheating during the war. They hadn't been cheating by designing new cars during the war. Riley, as we know, had, because the RM series Riley came into production suspiciously quickly afterwards. The Issigonis Morris Minor was suspiciously quick to come along. They'd been cheating during the war. They'd been working on new cars when they should have been working on scout cars and Lord knows what else. The T-Series became the TC apparently because the staff at Abingdon, which really included Sid Enever and one or two people, and just a little bit of input from Jack Daniels, who was still at Cowley, they sat down and said, well, we're going to be a PC engine, what are we going to do? And I think it was agreed, they said, we will get, here's a TV, they said, we will get the TV out and we will look at all the service records and see what was wrong with the TV. See what we can do and make a new car out of it. Now, again, there are people here who know a lot more than I do about the detail of what's different on the TC compared to the TB. Hands up anyone who knows them all, I'm sure some of you guys do. But it's a lot of detail, isn't it? Everything was from a slightly wider cockpit to different rear suspension fixings and all that sort of thing. But it was a matter of weeks. It was a matter of weeks that went into it. So TB to TC, again, was an incredibly rushed development program. And we know, do we not, that the first TB from new tools was made before the end of 1945, which was a miracle because Abingdon as a factory had to be cleared of tanks and had to be cleared of all the military stuff. And then the rudimentary car building facilities had to be put back in. The TC then went into production. Now this was definitely a period when it is a miracle that MG survived again, or at least a miracle the T-Series survived, because the T-Series arrived on a wing and a prayer, virtually no innovation compared with the 1939 motor car, and thank goodness the world wanted cars. Now, it was at this time that MG started exporting cars, not just to the States, but again, I think if you look at the figures, and I think the figures are in here, if you look at the figures, it was the late 1940s period when the export of MG sports cars really began. And there was an absolutely bottomless pit of demand out there in the world. So therefore, we know, do we not, that the T-Series, the TC, which was really not really much better than the TV at all, nor did it need to be. The T-Series, TC, sold incredibly well, and in 4 years, almost exactly 10,000 were made. Now that's a lot of motor cars, because I think MG probably only made 20,000 cars in the 1930s altogether, MG, and yet in 4 years after the war, there were 10,000 TCs. The important thing is that they were sold all over the world, still right-hand drive only, by the way. They were sold all over the world, but I think the figure is that more than 2,000 of them went to the States with right-hand drive. The legends, of course, are that the United States military officers had discovered MGs during the war, and they all came over here to military bases, and they'd all bought themselves a cute little English sports car to have, and they all enjoyed it, and the word got around. That may be true. The design of MG sports cars was still concentrated design, such as it was at Cowley. And it really, again, is a miracle that this car survived, because by this time, Gerard Palmer had gone. He'd gone to Jarrett to design the Javelin. Hubert Charles had gone years ago and never came back. Alec Issigonis was not interested at all. He was designing Morris Minors, and Alec Issigonis was amazingly single-minded. He only thought about the Morris Minor. Jack Daniels was still there, and one or two other people, but basically the only people who really kept the flags flying were at Abingdon. One was Sid Enever, the young man who started as a development engineer, who then became the engineer, the chief engineer. Sid Enever was at Abingdon. Apparently was never drafted to Cowley or attracted to Cowley. He was always at Abingdon. And the other rising star, thank goodness, who rose rapidly to become general manager by the end of the 1940s was John Thornley. Now, John Thornley, again, as you know, had started life as an enthusiast like us, club enthusiast in North London. He was an accountant. He joined MG to run the MG Car Club, which is your club. He started the MG Car Club, but he became service manager at Abingdon in the 30s, and then he became general manager at Abingdon from the end of the 1940s. So Sid Enever and John Thornley between them, and Jack Daniels, when he could get away from Issigonis from time to time, were the only people who were working on new cars. It was those people who really got together. First of all, they, if you like, influenced the Nuffield organisation to design the Y-Series saloon, which is important to all you TD owners, because as you know, the Y-Series saloon had independent front suspension, it had a box section chassis frame, and so on, most of which was modified to make into the TD sports car of 1950. Again, it's all written down. The time schedule for developing the TD from nothing was certainly months. It was all done during the calendar year of 1949. The only, if you like, the only innovation was that the chassis was, if you like, a cut and channeled and modified version of the Y-Series saloon. The body shell was, okay, someone sat down with a TC shell and said, well, if we make it wider here and a bit longer here, there's a definite family resemblance between the two. They happened very quickly indeed, and the first major difference was left-hand drive was available. So this again tells us, again, the figures back it up, this again tells us why the TD was such a success. That for the first time ever on an MG, the left-hand drive was available. And I think you'll find that if you really go back to the bottom of this, the left-hand drive man in the Nuffield organisation was a man called Charles Griffin, who worked at Wolseley Motors during the war as an apprentice. He moved down to Cowley as chief development engineer, and Charles once told me in an interview that he spent the first 2 years after the war doing left-hand drive conversions for every model that was going to be made because of the export drive. So Charles Griffin, who became Alec Isigonis's number 2 on minis and everything like that, he was much to be credited for with the left-hand drive TD. Figures prove it. Again, somebody out there give me a figure. How many TDs were made? 29,000? Right, well done. You get a lollipop as well. 29,000 something. That is 3 times as many as there had been TCs, and that was 5 times as many as there had been, and so on and so on. Wonderful achievement. Now, we all enjoyed the TD. I certainly did. It's one of the first sports cars I ever sat in. I didn't drive one because I couldn't afford one. It's one of the first sports cars I ever sat in when I was at university. I remember one particular night I joined the motor club. We were going out for a drive somewhere, and I was offered, how about this for a choice? I was offered a drive out to some pub in Oxfordshire as a co-driver. My choice was between a Triumph TR2 and an MGTD. And I was a little nut in those days. I went out in one and came back in the other. So that was when I first got to know quite a bit about TDs and things like it. This was the point when there was another big crisis at MG, in that everyone from John Thornley downwards knew that the T-Series was now, frankly, if you like, beyond its best. Great car, but it was no longer of its best. It was looking old-fashioned. Sorry guys, but it's true. It was looking old-fashioned. It wasn't very quick. And people were saying, well, we've had one of these before, and so on and so on. And it was facing big competition from other British sports cars. The important person it had to face up against was Donald Healey. And the point about this was that Donald Healey, lived in Warwick, not far from here, and Leamington, sorry, and obviously had his premises in Warwick. And he knew the Austin company very well, he knew Len Lord very well. And somehow or other, Donald Healey managed to persuade Len Lord that by using various bits and pieces from the Austin parts bin, particularly those that Austin couldn't sell enough of, he would produce a sports car, which became the Austin Healey 100. He would produce a sports car that would make a lot of money for him, Donald Healey, and also for the Austin Motor Company, which became BMC. Unhappily, Sid Enever and Co. had produced this excellent, smart, pretty motor car, which I call the MGA. It wasn't, it was an EX something, it was a prototype, which looked very much like the MGA. And they also went to Leonard Lord and said, we want to make this car at Abingdon. It was going to have an all-steel ball and an all-steel body shell, and so on and so on. As you know, and I'm sure many of you have owned MGAs as well, great car. I love the MGA, and there's no doubt that it was at least as good a car as the Austin Healey 100 at the time. Unfortunately for John Thornley and Co., they got to Len Lord just a little bit too late. He'd had the approaches from Donald Healey, and Donald Healey had sold him the idea of the Austin Healey project. That was when the TD, whether we like it or not, had to continue for a little while longer than it ought to have done, although, as we know, it's sold in big numbers. But this explains why even there was a TF. Because if Sid Enever and John Thornley had got their way, and if they'd got the MGA prototype theme approved by Len Lord at the time, there would never have been a TF. But the awful thing is they came back to Abingdon, having had their meetings at Longbridge with Len Lord, faces as long as boots. They knew that they weren't going to get anywhere with him. They knew that something would have to be done to compete against the Austin Healey 3000, the Austin Healey 100. Oh, by the way, the Triumph TR2 was coming along as well, both of which were a lot quicker, both of which were pretty, and so on and so on. Enter the TF. And I've got a note here that makes it quite simple. TF Hasty facelift, question mark. Well, yes. Funnily enough, the first T-Series car I saw this morning on the way up the motorway was a very beautiful red TF. It was again weeks, not months and not years, it was weeks in preparation. Literally, John Thornley and Enema and one or two of his body people sat in the corner and said, okay, we've got to live with this car, but we've got to do something. We've got to do something to keep it going, to keep Abingdon busy. And as John Thornley once said, it was a case of we do this, we do that, we do that. Why don't we do this? Why didn't we do that? In a matter of weeks, they had styled, if that's the word, they had styled what became the MGTF. And those of you who have both cars, some of you might even have both cars right now, you will realise that an awful lot of the main tub of the TF is still the tub of the TD. The chassis, of course, is basically the same with the improvements. But the difference is made at the front with that nice sloping bonnet, with the grille that sits back quite a bit, and a different shape of front wings made a difference. Spent very, very little indeed in tooling money to make it. In fact, again, John Thornley always used to say, we designed the TF ourselves. We said, this is what we want to do to put it in production. We then sent it to Cowley so that they could draw it. So Cowley apparently, as they said, they used to draw around it on pieces of paper so that they could eventually officially draw the body shell for the TF that Thornley and co had literally mocked up at Abingdon. It was a car that did remarkably well, considering A, that MG, not even John Thornley and co, had wanted to do it in the first place. And it had to last against cars like the TR2, which did 105 miles an hour. It had to last against the Austin Healey, which was a much bigger car, but that was 110 miles an hour. And it had to sell in the States. It did remarkably well. The only major change made to it was that the last of the engine changes were made to produce what is called the XP-EG version of the engine, and that was done by Morris Engines in Coventry. That really brings us almost to the end of the story, except to say that the T-Series has done remarkably well. The T-Series have gone on for many more years than any previous generation pedigree had at Abingdon. Let's work it out. The TA started in 1936, the last was made in 1955. That's 19 years with a break for the war. Remarkable story. It had sold incredibly well. It had made a lot of money. It had made a lot of people, look at you, very happy. Made a lot of people very happy. And it's still looked upon as the classic MG. The MGA was a wonderful car. After all, 100,000 MGAs were made. The MGA came along to replace the TF, and people looked at it and said, well, it's nice, but it's not really an MG, is it? And I promise you that was said at the time. Some of you guys are too young to remember. But the MGA was definitely treated as almost as an imposter for a time. The TF goes down as the last of the really beautiful classic MG sports car. But the point of my story, and it now comes to an end, is to say what a remarkable story for a motor car behind which big money was never thrown, big product planning efforts, that's a phrase that didn't exist in the 30s, by the way. Product planning rarely went into it. There were motor cars always built, designed, styled, looked at and loved. They were built by real enthusiasts. And I suspect that without the names that I've mentioned, and I'll particularly go back to just mentioning Cecil Kimber, of course, John Thornley, of course, Sid Edinburgh, of course, without those people, we'd never have had TS to love today. So that's the MGT series story. As I said, you probably knew 99% of that yourselves, but it explains to you, I hope, why I have got such a great interest in these cars, and why I still look at them as I did this morning when I came walking up the drive and thought, isn't that nice? Ladies and gentlemen, the T-Series story.